Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew Kane had spent months weaving an illusion of stability, an illusion in which he played the part of a reformed hero, a guiding hand in Willow's life, a respectable quartermain, a man reborn after suffering. To many in Port Charles, it was convincing. But illusions only hold until someone dares to look beneath the surface. And no one looked deeper, no one more relentlessly, than Liesl and Britt. Her silence had never meant surrender. Her grief had never meant defeat. Behind her quiet demeanor was a hurricane, biding its time, gathering its strength. And when Britt, her daughter, her heart, her vengeance, returned from the grave, that hurricane evolved into something even more devastating. The reckoning that followed would not simply strip Drew of his power. It would dismantle the very identity he had forged to protect his sins. The world had mourned Britt. Her death at the hands of the Hook had been grieved, memorialized, and used as a symbol of chaos in the city. But that death had been a carefully orchestrated deception. Liesl, always steps ahead of the world, had staged her daughter's disappearance to protect her from something far more insidious than a serial killer, an invisible threat that had been manipulating from the inside. At first, Liesl believed the enemy was Peter, then Victor. But it was Drew, transformed, corrupted, twisted beneath layers of programming and ambition, who had become the true danger. He had risen from captivity not as a survivor, but as a calculating force of destruction. On Cassadine Island, Drew had been broken down and rebuilt with precision. But Victor had not created a puppet, he had uncovered something already dormant within Drew, something opportunistic, cold, and calculating. The programming did not implant darkness, it merely unlocked it. Liesl saw it in his eyes when he returned. She heard it in his voice when he spoke of protecting Willow, while secretly isolating her from Michael and coercing Portia into falsifying medical records. What Drew called love was control. What he called justice was revenge. And the Drew that had once carried Liesl to Willow's side had vanished, replaced by a man who would destroy anything to maintain his illusion of virtue. It wasn't just the manipulation of Willow that enraged Liesl. It was the betrayal of Monica, a woman who had opened her heart to Drew and trusted him as family. It was his alliance with Ezra Boyle, a man whose name sent chills down Liesl's spine. Ezra had long been a collector of secrets, a grave robber in the truest sense. He trafficked in legacies, bought and sold histories like artifacts, and Drew had offered him access to the most sacred of all, the Himmel family tomb. Within that tomb were the bones not just of aristocrats, but of murderers, rebels, and martyrs, each with a story carefully preserved through generations of secrecy. Drew saw only opportunity. Ezra saw profit. Liesl saw desecration. Britt had tried to outrun her past. Living under assumed names, changing continents like clothes, she tried to forget the screams, the blood, the endless nights in hiding. But her mother's call shattered that exile. The betrayal wasn't just personal. Drew had weaponized Britt's death for sympathy. He had publicly mourned her while privately aligning with the very forces that had driven her underground. Worse still, Britt discovered that Drew had tried to have her officially declared dead, an action that would have allowed him access to certain quartermain holdings tied to Britt's inheritance. Liesl had suspected it. Britt had confirmed it. And neither would forgive it. Their plan didn't unfold overnight. Liesl began laying the groundwork by subtly infiltrating Drew's public image. She sent anonymous packages to the press, hinting at inconsistencies in Drew's financial reports. She dropped evidence of his secret meetings with Ezra to Monica's private investigator. Meanwhile, Britt posed as a consultant for a foreign medical board, gaining access to General Hospital's archives. She traced Drew's influence in reshuffling patient care orders, discovered unauthorized sedatives linked to Portia's ward, and uncovered a cache of erased footage in the hospital security database. Every piece was added to a growing puzzle, one that, when completed, painted a portrait of a man not corrupted by programming, but by choice. The coup de grace came in the form of a psychological trap, a manipulation worthy of Peter August himself. Liesl sent Drew a message, encrypted and urgent, claiming that Ezra had betrayed him and was preparing to flee the country with documents that would tie both of them to several illegal archaeological extractions. The message instructed Drew to meet in the woods outside Port Charles, near the same remote cabin where Peter had begged for his life. Drew, desperate to control the narrative and silence Ezra, followed the bait. What he found there was no partner, no betrayal, only judgment. The cabin was cloaked in darkness. A small generator powered a projector that hummed to life the moment Drew stepped inside. On the wooden walls, images flickered, his own face, caught in grainy footage, whispering secrets to Ezra, nodding as Portia delivered falsified results, holding Willow's hand while condemning Michael. Voices echoed, layered over each other like ghosts screaming for acknowledgement. Liesl's voice joined them, narrating the descent of a man once believed to be a hero. And then came Britt. Not on screen, but in person, stepping from the shadows. She was changed. Gone was the compassionate doctor who had wept in silence. In her place stood a woman who had witnessed her own funeral, who had heard her enemies laugh over her ashes. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply looked Drew in the eyes and told him he was finished. Liesl arrived moments later, dressed not in the costume of vengeance but in the stark simplicity of truth. She held a syringe filled with a compound derived from her own work in neurological sedation, a serum that wouldn't kill Drew, but would dismantle the very architecture of his ego. One injection would leave him alive, but vulnerable, suggestible, stripped of the manipulative instincts that had defined his new self. He resisted. He screamed. But the serum took hold. And with each passing second, his voice softened, his knees buckled, his eyes glazed. By the time the authorities arrived, tipped off by an anonymous source claiming to have found a dangerous fugitive in the woods, Drew Kane was no longer a threat. He was a broken man with fragments of memories and no defense. The fallout was catastrophic. The Quartermain board called an emergency session and stripped Drew of all executive authority. Monica released a statement disavowing any connection to him. Willow, heart shattered but clear-eyed, left with the children and refused to return. Michael reinstated himself as the legal guardian and named Sonny as secondary caretaker. Ezra was extradited to face charges across 3 countries. And Britt, once the ghost, left no forwarding address, only a single message emailed to Liesl: "It's done. I'm free now. So are you." The legacy of the Albrecht women became something of a myth in Port Charles. Not just a story of vengeance, but a cautionary tale. They had not sought blood, they had sought justice. And in delivering it, they exposed the fragility of masks, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the truth that even the most powerful men can be shattered by the very people they underestimate. Drew Kane did not die. But what remained of him was a shell, a soft-spoken patient in a long-term care facility, mumbling fractured phrases, incapable of harm, incapable of manipulation. Liesl visited once, months later. She stood at the foot of his bed, watching as he stared out the window, unaware of her presence. She said nothing. There was no need. Her silence spoke everything. Retribution had been delivered. The family name had been defended. And a woman who had once been dismissed as a side note in a man's story had now become the author of his downfall. In the end, Drew Kane became what he had feared most, not forgotten, but remembered for all the wrong reasons. And the names of Liesl and Britt Albrecht were etched into the legend of Port Charles not as villains, not as victims, but as survivors who rewrote the ending with fire, ice, and terrifying precision. When Drew opened his eyes, the world around him no longer resembled the one he had once controlled with quiet authority and calculated charm. His wrists ached from the cold steel handcuffs fastened tightly around them, and 2 uniformed local officers stood beside the hospital bed, their expressions stern but not surprised, as though they'd long been waiting for this man to fall from his pedestal. His mind was sluggish, his vision slightly blurred, but there was no mistaking the reality of the moment. He was under arrest. The dossier delivered to the authorities had been extensive. Hundreds of pages meticulously compiled, each entry a blade carving away the lies he had cloaked himself in. From falsifying medical records to blackmailing Portia, from tampering with evidence to orchestrating deals with Ezra Boyle that traded sacred family legacies for profit, Drew's sins had been unspooled, examined, and exposed. Every secret he thought he'd buried now formed the bedrock of his own undoing. His private meetings with Ezra, captured on camera. Financial transactions traced to offshore accounts. Audio clips of him threatening legal action against Willow if she sought full custody of the children. And perhaps most damning of all, the video confession he had never meant to make, extracted from his broken psyche under Liesl's carefully orchestrated serum, played on loop for the authorities before they ever laid eyes on him. The devastation was swift and merciless. Monica Quartermaine, the matriarch who had once welcomed him into her family with unwavering love, refused to visit him. Her silence was a blade sharper than any condemnation. The woman who had embraced him as a son, who had defended him before the hospital board and shielded him from scandal, had reached her limit. The betrayal of the Quartermaine legacy, his manipulation of the Himmel vault, his collusion with Ezra, his betrayal of Willow, had severed the last thread between them. Willow, perhaps the one whose heart was shattered most profoundly, disappeared without a word. She gathered the children, packed only the essentials, and vanished. No note. No destination. Only a chilling absence. She didn't return Drew's calls. She didn't respond to the attorneys. She simply erased him from the lives of the very people he once claimed to protect. Her silence echoed louder than rage. Nina never made a public statement. She didn't stand at podiums or deliver impassioned monologues. But those who saw her in the days after the fallout described her as a ghost, her voice hollow, her eyes distant. And yet, when she looked at Drew for the last time in that courtroom, her gaze burned with a mixture of betrayal, disgust, and infinite disappointment. She didn't need words. Her silence condemned him more than any gavel ever could. As for Britt, she vanished once more, this time not into hiding but into anonymity. No one knew where she went. No one saw her leave. It was as though she had simply returned to the shadows from which she had briefly emerged. Her reappearance had not been for reconciliation, not for healing, it had been for reckoning. And with that reckoning complete, she faded once more into the wind, satisfied that justice had been served. Liesl Albrecht watched it all from a distance. She stood across the street as the patrol cars drove Drew away. She didn't approach. She didn't interfere. She simply stood in the rain, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her eyes tracking the flashing red and blue lights until they disappeared down the road. Her mission was complete. The pain, the rage, the helplessness that had once consumed her when she believed Britt was dead, those emotions had been alchemized into a single, unwavering resolve. And now, with Drew caged by his own crimes, that resolve could rest. Drew Kane did not die, not in the literal sense. His heart continued to beat. His lungs still filled with air. But what had once made him a man of influence, respect, and charisma had been stripped away with surgical precision. He was sent to a high-security psychiatric facility, not because he was insane, but because the serum Liesl had administered left him mentally fractured. He oscillated between lucidity and confusion, between remembering his crimes and denying them. The doctors called it identity erosion. A state in which the patient can no longer differentiate between constructed lies and former truths. Inside those sterile walls, the name Quartermaine held no sway. He was not a leader, not a father, not a lover. He was a patient identified by a number, watched 24/7, monitored for erratic behavior, sedated during his violent outbursts. He scribbled incoherent thoughts on the walls of his room. He whispered secrets to people who weren't there. He spoke Britt's name in his sleep and cried without knowing why. And sometimes, just before the sedatives pulled him under again, he would scream Liesl's name, not out of anger, but out of the raw, visceral terror that came from knowing she had beaten him. Outside the facility, the world moved on. Port Charles recovered. The Quatermains adapted. General Hospital saw new leadership. Willow, though still hidden from public view, slowly began to rebuild her life. The scars Drew left would never fully heal, but the people he harmed no longer carried the weight of his manipulations. And Drew? He remained in that cold, windowless room. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. Occasionally, new doctors were assigned to his case, all baffled by the cocktail of psychological and neurological symptoms that made him unfit to stand trial but not insane enough to set free. He existed in limbo. A purgatory meticulously designed by the two women he had underestimated most. His fall had not come from a single blow. It had not been bloody or violent. It had been slow, deliberate, elegant. A death not of the body, but of legacy, of identity, of the illusion he had worked so hard to preserve. Liesl and Britt had not needed to end his life to end his reign. They had merely held up a mirror, forced him to look, and ensured that when he finally saw what he truly was, the world would see it too. And that was the true punishment, to live not as Drew Kane the savior, the hero, the lover, but as a warning. A broken man with nothing left but the haunting echo of the truth. No one in Port Charles dared to speak the name Albrecht with condescension anymore. The air around it had changed, thickened with warning, heavy with history. Once a surname whispered with ridicule or laced with suspicion, it had become something far more formidable, a name cloaked in reverence and fear. Liesl had not just avenged her daughter, she had delivered a chilling reminder to everyone in that fractured town, that her family was not a weakness to exploit, but a line carved in stone. Cross it, and there would be no negotiations, no mercy, no second chances. She did not need weapons or armies. Her power was patience, strategy, and a cold, undiluted sense of purpose that cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Through her actions, Liesl rewrote the legacy of the Albrecht name. Once dismissed as an eccentric, a villain, or worse, a grieving relic of a more chaotic past, she had now become the embodiment of final justice, the kind that does not abide by legal codes but by personal reckoning. The city had watched her dismantle Drew Kane not with violence, but with precision, layer by layer, until nothing of the man he once pretended to be remained. She didn't destroy him in anger. She destroyed him in grief. And that made her fury eternal, elemental. She did not burn hot and reckless. She moved like ice, slow, crushing, irreversible. Every citizen who had ever doubted her capacity for brilliance now stood corrected. Every politician, every doctor, every socialite who had once exchanged glances behind her back, who had whispered, unstable, or dangerous, as if she couldn't hear, now they avoided her gaze, nodded respectfully in passing, kept their distance. They understood. The Albrechts were not a spectacle. They were not tragic. They were not broken. They were a storm that had learned to wait, and when it finally came, it did not leave survivors, it left silence. The punishment she delivered to Drew was more than a personal vendetta. It was symbolic. It was transformative. He had crossed a line that should never have been touched, the sanctity of maternal love, the delicate, unspoken truth that a mother who has buried her child has nothing left to lose. And yet, Liesl had not lost everything. She had reclaimed her daughter, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit, in justice, in balance. She restored honor not only to Britt, but to herself, to Nina, to the broken bonds Drew had arrogantly presumed could be rewritten or ignored. What Drew failed to grasp, what ultimately sealed his fate, was that not all justice is dispensed in courtrooms. Some is sown in shadows, watered by grief, and harvested through consequence. The institutions of Port Charles had tried to deal with men like Drew before and failed, but Liesl succeeded because she understood a simple truth. Real punishment isn't about spectacle. It's about emptiness. About ensuring the person you bring down wakes up every day aware that they've lost everything, and that no apology, no performance, no redemption arc will ever bring it back. He learned that lesson too late. By the time the truth caught up with him, he was already a hollow man. His name was no longer spoken with admiration but with disdain. His achievements erased, his titles revoked, his friendships vanished. People who once shook his hand now avoided eye contact. Those who once defended him now denounced him. He was a pariah cloaked in shame, a cautionary tale of how ego and manipulation could disguise themselves in virtue until someone brave enough tore off the mask. And Liesl had been that someone. But the true brilliance of her justice lay not in the destruction itself, it was in the restraint. She could have leaked more. She could have unleashed even deeper scandals. She could have obliterated every last bridge he had built. But she didn't. She left him just enough, to suffer, to think, to wither slowly in the absence of dignity. Liesl didn't crave blood. She craved silence. Stillness. Peace. And the only way to achieve that was to ensure the man who had desecrated her family would never again have a voice loud enough to disturb it. Port Charles will remember this, not as a scandal, but as a turning point. They will remember that you do not challenge the Albrecht bloodline unless you are prepared to sacrifice everything. Liesl had no need to scream or protest. Her justice was quiet. It did not announce itself with a bang, but with the soft, dreadful realization that someone had underestimated the wrong woman. And when the dust settled, the city stood not just in awe, but in warning. Because now, they understood, Liesl Albrecht was not just a mother, not just a doctor, not just a relic of the past. She was a reckoning, born of grief, shaped by loss, and perfected by love. And anyone who threatened her family, anyone who mistook her silence for submission, would face a punishment far worse than death, a slow, methodical unmaking from which there was no return.